to drive to Faisalabad, Pakistan. This was about 2 weeks before we captured Abu Zubaydah. And we had $2 million in cash in the van with us in 2 duffel bags. And my colleague said, I could never understand why people would cheat on their accounting paperwork for $20 or $30. What would possess you to cheat the CIA out of $20? If you're going to steal millions. And we looked at each other and laughed. And I said, yeah, I wouldn't even steal the millions. And he said, no, neither would I.
Yeah, it'd be a little hard to pass the polygraph on that, right?
That's right.
But it's not unfathomable for a high-level source. I know in Zero Dark 30, they have a scene in there, and they're trying to get a source to come up with a phone number, and he wants a Lamborghini, so they just get him a Lamborghini in the middle of the night. That's not far-fetched.
No, that's actually easy. You just take a big sack of money over to the Lamborghini dealership by the airport, and next thing you know, you've got a Lamborghini. Yes.
He's happy, and you got the phone number you want or the information you want, and moving on.
Exactly right. It's all in the name of the successful operation. All of it.
Yeah.
I remember just after 9/11, I went up to Ambassador Black and I said, Kofor, I wanted to talk to you if you have a minute. I have an idea for an operation. And before I could get the words out of my mouth, he put his hands up and he said, whatever it is, just do it. I have so much money, I can't possibly spend it all. And that continued for years after the 9/11 attacks.
Really? And where did that money come from?
Congress couldn't appropriate it fast enough. We were receiving multi-billion-dollar supplemental appropriations. So we had our fixed budget that the oversight committees had, or the appropriations committee had appropriated and the oversight committees had authorized. And then literally the day after 9/11, we got something like 160% supplemental appropriation, and then got another one again at the end of the year. We really couldn't spend it all.
And you had no problem with that. To you, that's business, and you're doing what you have to do to get what you need to get. When was the first time you became aware of and had a problem with, I guess we'll call them enhanced interrogation techniques?
I had an inkling when I was still in Pakistan. We captured so many al-Qaeda fighters on the night of the Abu Zubaydah capture that we had to bring them into our safe house for interrogation in shifts in a paddy wagon. And the first group of 10 came out of the paddy wagon, and they were all wearing hoods. And I said to one of my colleagues, he was working for me, I said, why are they hooded? And he said, we don't want them to see our faces. And I got angry and I said, are you seriously telling me that you have never read the Geneva Convention? It is a war crime to put hoods on them. Take the hoods off. And he said, stop, don't take the hoods off. And I said, I'm going to report you to headquarters. And he said, I'm going to report you to headquarters. I said, fine. And I took the hoods off. And we reported each other to headquarters. And I was reprimanded. So I thought, wow, well, the Geneva Convention is crystal clear that hooding a prisoner is a war crime. I guess it's a new world. I'm going to have to get used to it. But then I got back from Pakistan in May of 2002, and I was standing in the sandwich line at the CIA cafeteria, and a senior officer walked up to me very casually, and he said, hey, I'm glad I ran into you. Would you be interested in being trained in the use of enhanced interrogation techniques? I had never heard that term before. And I said, enhanced interrogation techniques, what's that mean? And he said, very seriously, he said, we're going to start getting rough with these guys. And I said, well, what does that mean? And he described these 10 techniques. And I said, that sounds like a torture program. And he said, no, it's not torture. The Justice Department approved it and the president signed off on it. I said, give me an hour. I need an hour to think about it. So I just walked out of the cafeteria. I went up to the 7th floor of the CIA, which was the executive floor. There was an extraordinarily senior officer up there for whom I had worked in the Middle East 10 years earlier. And I knocked on his door and I said, hey, I need some advice. I was just asked if I want to be trained in these enhanced interrogation techniques. What do you think of that? And he said, first of all, let's call a spade a spade. He said, this is a torture program, and torture is a slippery slope. And you know how these guys are. Somebody's going to go overboard and they're going to kill a prisoner. And when that happens, there's going to be a congressional investigation, and there's going to be a Justice Department investigation, and somebody's going to go to prison. Do you want to go to prison? And I said, no, I don't want to go to prison. So I went back downstairs and I said, look, I have an ethical and moral problem with this, and I think it's illegal. I'm not interested. And I'm sorry to tell you that of the 14 people that were approached, I was the only one who said no. And so I had a friend in the Counterterrorism Center who he happens to be a psychiatrist and a brigadier general. And we go to the same church. We're in the same men's group. And he came up to me a few days later and he said, you know, they're calling you the human rights guy behind your back. I said, yeah, I know. I've heard it. And he said, you know, that's not a compliment, right? And I said, Steve, I don't care. I'm on the right side of this, and they are not. And I'm sticking with my guns.
What were some of the 10 on the list?
Well, it started off with a few that were very mild. I would not consider to be torture, where, you know, you grab somebody by the lapels and give them a shake and say, answer my questions, doggone you. And then it graduated to a smack on the belly. It was called an attention slap because it leaves a handprint. It makes a loud cracking sound. Then it was a slap in the face. But it graduated to things like waterboarding, where the prisoner is strapped down on a board. His feet are elevated compared to his head. Cloth is put in his mouth, and then water is poured on his face. And it's supposed to induce a feeling of drowning. In fact, in the case of Abu Zubaydah, he did drown and had to be revived because too much water had gotten down his throat and his heart stopped beating. But then there were a couple of other things that I believed were worse than waterboarding. One was called the cold cell, where a prisoner was stripped naked. He was chained to an eye bolt in the ceiling like this. His cell was chilled to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And then every hour, a CIA officer would go into the cell and throw a bucket of ice water on him. And we murdered several prisoners that way. They died of hypothermia. There was another one that sounds like it's no big deal, but it was sleep deprivation. So again, you're stripped naked, chained to that eye bolt in the ceiling, so you can't kneel or lay or get comfortable in any way. Loud acid rock music is pumped into the cell. These industrial strength lights are on 24 hours a day. Well, we know that, this is according to the American Psychological Association, the APA, that people begin to lose their minds around day 7 with no sleep. They begin to die around day 9, die of organ failure. But the CIA was authorized to keep people awake for up to 12 days. And people died because of that technique as well. So I said, listen, you know, this is so clearly illegal. I had done some research on my own. We have a law in this country called the Federal Torture Act of 1946, which specifically outlawed exactly those techniques that the CIA was now using. And in fact, we executed Japanese soldiers who had waterboarded American POWs during the Second World War. Furthermore, in January of 1968, the Washington Post ran a front page photograph of an American soldier waterboarding a North Vietnamese prisoner. On the day that that picture was published, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara ordered an investigation. The soldier was arrested. He was convicted of torture and sentenced to 20 years at Leavenworth. And then, like magic, in 2002, all these things are suddenly legal. Well, we never amended the law. The law never changed. We changed. We took on this air of victimhood that because we were the good guys and we lost 3,000 civilians on September 11th, that it was okay for us to do this because we had to stop this existential threat that Al-Qaeda had become.
And once you became aware of all this going on, how did you become a whistleblower? How did you actually do it?
Only very reluctantly. And I'll tell you, I wish that I could tell you that I stood up and I told them, that's not the way it happened at all. This was clearly illegal in my view. So I waited for somebody who was directly involved in the torture to come forward and go public.
All right, man. This is wild, but yeah, I'm glad people like this guy Jon Kiriakou and all these other people are these whistleblowers are coming out and exposing these clowns for all the crimes that they have committed, all the international crimes, and the fact that the things like the Geneva Convention and international law is really meaningless with rogue elements in these organizations, guys. But shout out to him, guys. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe, man. Peace.